3 days. That's how long the excavator had been sinking. 3 days of engines screaming, cables snapping, and some of the most expensive construction equipment in Iowa doing absolutely nothing. And yet the machine kept sinking. Slowly, steadily, like the swamp had decided it was hungry. By the morning of the third day, the excavator was nearly half buried. A 60-ton machine worth more than $500,000 disappearing into mud, and every engineer on the site had already said the same thing. Nothing could pull it out. But they were about to be proven very, very wrong, because an old farmer was about to arrive, driving a tractor most people would have laughed at, and behind his barn sat a machine built in 1912. The construction site was supposed to be routine. Donovan Construction had been hired to build a new section of highway cutting across farmland outside a quiet county in Iowa. Stay with me until the end. Before we begin, please take a moment to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and comment where you're watching from. Now, let's get into it. For the first 6 months, everything went exactly as planned. Survey crews mapped the land, bulldozers leveled the soil, concrete trucks poured the foundation for the first bridge supports. The machines on that project were the kind most people only see in documentaries: massive yellow excavators, bulldozers weighing more than a fully loaded semi-truck, machines designed to move mountains. And the man in charge of it all was Frank Donnelly. Frank was 45 years old and already one of the most successful contractors in the state. He had started his business 20 years earlier with a used backhoe and a pickup truck. Back then, he had done everything himself: digging trenches, pouring concrete, repairing engines late into the night. But he had one quality that made him dangerous in business. He refused to fail. He worked 18 hours a day for years. And eventually, that stubborn determination built him something bigger than he ever imagined. By the time the highway project began, Donnelly Construction owned millions of dollars in equipment. Frank employed more than 150 workers, and he had built bridges, schools, and shopping centers all across eastern Iowa. Frank Donnelly believed in one thing above all else: modern machines solved modern problems. If something was broken, you bought better equipment. If something was difficult, you brought in bigger machines. And if something went wrong, you threw more horsepower at it. For 20 years, that philosophy had never failed him. Until the swamp. The swamp wasn't supposed to be there. On paper, the ground looked solid. Survey reports said the soil was stable, but anyone who had lived in Clayton County long enough knew the truth. There was a stretch of land along the edge of the construction route where the ground looked dry, but underneath it was nothing but water and soft mud. An underground spring fed the soil year-round. Most locals avoided the place completely, but the construction company didn't know that. And one morning, an excavator operator drove straight into it. At first, nothing seemed wrong. The excavator rolled forward across the grass toward a pile of dirt that needed clearing. Then the ground moved, just slightly. The operator felt the machine tilt, the tracks spun, and suddenly the entire 60-ton excavator began to sink. At first, the crew thought it was temporary. Excavators get stuck sometimes. It's not unusual. They brought in a bulldozer to pull it out. The bulldozer attached a heavy steel cable. The engine roared, tracks bit into the dirt. The cable stretched tight, and for a moment, everyone thought it was working. Then the bulldozer's tracks started spinning. Mud sprayed everywhere. The cable snapped loose, and the excavator sank another 6 inches. By the end of the first day, they had tried 3 different bulldozers. Nothing worked. On the second day, Frank called a heavy equipment recovery company from Des Moines. These were specialists, the kind of people who pulled trucks out of rivers and cranes out of collapsed construction sites. They arrived with a massive truck carrying a 50-ton winch. The plan was simple. They ran a thick steel cable from the winch to the excavator. Then they anchored the truck to a reinforced concrete foundation nearly half a mile away. If anything could pull that excavator free, it would be that winch. The engine started. The cable tightened. The winch screamed as it began pulling. For a moment, the excavator shifted, just barely. Then the ground gave way. The anchor ripped out of the soil like it had been planted in sand. The steel cable went slack, and the excavator sank another 6 inches. By the end of the second day, the machine was nearly buried to its tracks. Frank Donnelly stood at the edge of the swamp, staring at $500,000 slowly disappearing. Every hour that machine stayed stuck was costing him money. Workers were idle, schedules were delayed, and the state contract had penalties for missed deadlines. One engineer suggested bringing in a crane. Frank agreed immediately. On the third morning, a massive crane arrived. The operator stepped out of the cab, walked to the edge of the swamp, and stopped. He stood there quietly for almost a minute. Then he shook his head. "No chance," he said. Frank frowned. "What do you mean, no chance?" "That ground won't hold this crane," the operator replied. "If I drive out there, you won't have one stuck machine. You'll have two." And then he packed up and left. By noon, the third day, the mood at the construction site had changed. Nobody was talking much anymore. The engineers stood in a small group near the truck studying maps and soil reports. None of them had an answer. The excavator continued sinking. Not fast, but steadily. Every few hours, another inch. Frank rubbed his face and looked out across the swamp. "What about a helicopter?" one engineer asked. "A sky crane could lift it." Frank shook his head. "Those cost $15,000 an hour," he said. "And the closest one is in Minnesota." He gestured toward the excavator. "By the time it gets here, that machine will be underground." Another engineer suggested draining the swamp. Frank laughed bitterly. "With what?" "That swamp is fed by a spring underground. We'd need a month and $1 million. Silence settled over the group. There were no more ideas, no more machines to try, no more solutions. That's when a tractor appeared on the dirt road beside the construction site. It wasn't one of theirs. It was a green tractor, moving slowly along the fence line, and driving it was a 73-year-old farmer. His name was Walter Brennan. Walter had lived on that land his entire life. 400 acres passed down through his family for generations. His farm bordered the highway construction project. For the past 6 months, he had watched the crews arrive, watched them survey the land, watched them bring in machines worth more than his entire farm. Walter wasn't the kind of man who complained. When the construction noise spooked his cattle, he didn't say anything. When trucks tore up the county road, he didn't say anything. When the project manager told him he'd have to move his fence line because of a survey mistake, he didn't complain. Walter Brennan wasn't a complainer. He was a watcher. And for the last 3 days, he had been watching that excavator sink. He watched the bulldozers fail. He watched the winch cable snap. He watched the crane operator refuse the job. And the whole time, Walter was thinking about mud, about traction, about torque. On the afternoon of the third day, he finally decided he had seen enough. Walter parked his tractor beside the construction site, climbed down, and walked slowly toward Frank Donnelly and the group of engineers. "Morning," Walter said calmly. Frank barely looked at him. "Site's closed," he said. "Insurance liability." "I'm not a visitor," Walter replied. "I'm your neighbor." Frank finally glanced up. Walter nodded toward the swamp. "Saw your problem," he said. "Thought maybe I could help." Frank looked at the old man, looked at the worn denim overalls, the mud-covered boots, the weathered face shaped by 50 years of Iowa winters, and then he laughed. "How exactly are you planning to help?" Frank asked. Walter pointed toward the excavator. "I can pull that out." The engineers looked at each other. Someone coughed. Frank laughed harder. "That excavator weighs 60 tons, he said. "What are you going to pull it with?" Walter shrugged slightly. "Not this tractor," he said. Frank smirked. "Oh, good," he replied, "because that thing weighs maybe 5 tons. Walter looked back toward his farm in the distance. "With my steamer." Frank blinked. "Your what?" Walter met his eyes calmly. "My steam traction engine. Case model, built in 1912. Frank stared at him for a moment. Then he burst out laughing again. A steam tractor from 1912. And this old farmer believed it could do what modern bulldozers, winches, and cranes could not. Frank wiped tears from his eyes. "You're telling me," he said, still laughing, "that some antique farm machine is going to pull out my $600,000 excavator?" Walter didn't laugh. He simply nodded. "Yep." Frank shook his head. "This is unbelievable." He pointed toward the bulldozers parked nearby. "Those machines make more horsepower than your entire farm. They couldn't move that excavator an inch." Walter looked at them. Then he looked back at Frank. Your machines make horsepower, Walter said quietly. Mine makes torque. Frank folded his arms. And what exactly is the difference? Walter smiled faintly. Horsepower is how fast you can do work. Torque is how much work you can do. And as the engineers listened, the old farmer began explaining something none of them had considered, and that explanation was about to change everything. Frank Donnelly crossed his arms and waited. The engineers stood quietly behind him. Some of the workers had stopped what they were doing and were now watching the conversation from a distance. An old farmer claiming he could solve a problem that had defeated modern construction equipment was the kind of thing people didn't want to miss. Walter Brennan didn't seem bothered by the attention. He stood calmly in the dirt road beside the site, hands resting on his belt, eyes fixed on the swamp where the excavator continued sinking inch by inch. Frank looked back toward the machine and shook his head. "You're telling me," he said, "a steam tractor built before World War I can do something my equipment can't?" Walter shrugged slightly. "It's not about when it was built. It's about what it was built for." Frank let out a short laugh. "And what exactly was it built for?" Walter pointed toward the swamp. "Pulling." The engineers exchanged skeptical looks. Walter continued. "Your bulldozers are made to push dirt on solid ground. Fast engines, high horsepower, lots of speed. But speed isn't what you need when something's buried in mud." He bent down and picked up a small clump of wet soil, squeezing it slowly in his hand. "Mud doesn't care how fast your engine spins. It cares about grip." Frank tilted his head. Walter nodded toward the bulldozer that had tried pulling. "The excavator earlier. Your machine spins its tracks when it hits resistance. Computer cuts power, prevents damage. That's smart engineering. But it also means your machine stops before the job is finished." Frank frowned. "And your steam engine doesn't?" Walter looked back toward his farm in the distance. "No. It just keeps pulling." Silence hung in the air for a moment. Finally, Frank sighed. "Well," he said, "we're out of ideas anyway." He gestured toward the swamp. "Go get your antique." Some of the workers chuckled. One of the engineers muttered quietly to another. "This ought to be entertaining." Walter didn't react. He simply nodded once, climbed back onto his green tractor, and slowly drove away toward his farm. For the next 2 hours, the construction site returned to its strange waiting. No one attempted another rescue. There wasn't anything left to try. Instead, the crew occasionally glanced down the road, curious whether the old farmer would actually return. Frank leaned against his truck, arms folded, staring out at the swamp. The excavator had sunk another few inches. Mud now pressed halfway up the tracks. Another day or two, and the machine would likely be lost completely. And that would be a disaster. Then, around noon, someone heard a sound. It was faint at first, a deep, rhythmic chuffing, slow, heavy, almost like the breathing of some giant animal. Workers began turning their heads toward the road. The sound grew louder. Chuff, chuff, chuff. Then came the whistle, a sharp blast of steam echoing across the flat farmland. And suddenly every person on that construction site turned to look. Over the hill on the dirt road, a massive black machine appeared. For a moment, nobody spoke. The thing looked enormous, a towering iron boiler. Huge steel wheels, taller than a man, thick pistons moving slowly as clouds of steam drifted from the valves. Walter Brennan sat high on the operator's platform, guiding the machine down the road at a slow, steady pace, 5 miles an hour, no faster. Drivers passing on the county road slowed to stare. Some even pulled over to watch. Machines like this hadn't traveled these roads in generations. By the time Walter reached the construction site, half the crew had gathered near the entrance. Frank straightened up. His expression had changed. He was no longer laughing, because now that the steam engine was in front of him, he realized something. The machine wasn't small. It wasn't fragile. It wasn't a museum toy. It was enormous. 22 tons of iron and steel. Rear drive wheels 6 feet tall, each studded with steel cleats designed to dig into the ground. The boiler gleamed dark black under the afternoon sun. Brass fittings shined like gold, one of the engineers whispered under his breath. Good Lord. Walter eased the steam engine to a stop roughly 200 feet from the swamp. He pulled a lever. Steam hissed. The massive wheels stopped turning. Walter climbed down slowly. Frank approached him. "That thing is bigger than I expected," Frank admitted. Walter smiled faintly. "She was built to work." Then he walked to the back of the engine and began uncoiling a thick chain. Not a cable, a chain. Each link was as thick as a man's wrist. One engineer stepped closer. "That chain won't hold," he said. "We snapped a cable rated for 50 tons. Walter shook his head. "This chain's rated for 80. And it stretches a little before it breaks." He lifted one of the heavy links. "Cable snaps instantly. Chain gives you warning." Then Walter threw the chain over his shoulder and began walking toward the swamp. The ground quickly turned soft. Mud swallowed his boots with every step, but he kept moving, step by step. The crew watched silently as the old farmer waded through mud toward the trapped excavator. When he reached the machine, he climbed onto the track frame and secured the chain tightly to the steel undercarriage. He tugged it twice, satisfied. Then he began walking back. By the time he reached solid ground again, mud covered him nearly to his chest. Walter didn't seem to notice. Frank stared at him. "You sure about this?" he asked. Walter wiped mud from his hands. "If something goes wrong," Frank continued, "that excavator costs more than your farm." Walter looked up at him calmly. "If something goes wrong," he said, "I guess I owe you an excavator." Then he climbed back onto the steam engine. Walter checked the pressure gauge. The needle sat steady. Perfect. He placed one hand on the throttle. The entire construction crew had gathered now. No one was laughing anymore. Because suddenly the situation felt very real. Walter slowly opened the throttle. The steam engine responded immediately. Chuff. The pistons moved. Chuff. Gears engaged. The giant steel wheels began turning, slow, deliberate. The chain stretched tight. For a moment, nothing happened. The excavator remained buried in the mud. Frank held his breath. Then the excavator moved, just an inch, but it moved. Someone shouted. Walter pushed the throttle slightly farther. The steam engine's rhythm deepened. Chuff, chuff, chuff. The massive cleated wheels dug into the ground like teeth. Mud flew behind them. The chain hummed with tension. The excavator shifted again, this time several inches. The crew erupted. "It's moving." Walter didn't look back. He focused only on the pressure gauge and the feel of the machine beneath him. More throttle, more steam. The engine pulled harder. The excavator slid forward another foot, then another. Mud released its grip with loud sucking. Sounds as the heavy tracks slowly rose from the swamp. 5 feet, 10 feet, 20 feet. The excavator was coming out. Workers were shouting now, cheering like spectators at a race. No one had expected this, not the engineers, not Frank, but the old machine from 1912 kept pulling, slow, steady, relentless, 30 feet, 40. Finally, the excavator broke free completely. Walter didn't stop. He pulled. The machine another 100 feet until it rested safely on solid ground. Then he closed the throttle. The steam engine slowed. Chuff, 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 and finally stopped. Walter pulled the whistle cord. The sharp cry of steam echoed across the Iowa farmland. For a moment, no one spoke. Then the construction crew exploded in cheers. Men slapped each other on the back. Some were laughing, in disbelief. Others just stared at the ancient machine that had done what millions of dollars in modern equipment couldn't. Frank Donnelly stood completely still. His arms hung at his sides. His face had gone pale. He looked from the excavator to the steam engine, to Walter Brennan standing calmly on the operator's platform, and in that moment, Frank realized something he had never considered in his entire career. Sometimes, the newest technology isn't the strongest. Sometimes the most powerful machine in the world is the one built simply to keep pulling. And the old steam engine had just proven it. The construction site slowly returned to normal. Workers drifted back to their machines. Engines started again. Radios crackled with instructions. But nobody was really working the same way they had that morning, because every man on that site had just watched something impossible happen. They had watched a 60-ton excavator come out of a swamp, pulled by a machine older than their grandfathers, and nobody could stop talking about it. Groups of workers stood around the excavator, studying the mud still dripping from its tracks. Others walked over to the steam engine just to stare at it up close. One of the younger operators ran his hand across the thick steel cleats on the giant rear wheel. "Feels like a tank," he said. An older mechanic standing beside him nodded slowly. "That's because back then," he said, "machines weren't built to be efficient. They were built to survive." Nearby, Frank Donnelly was still standing where he had watched the rescue happen. His crew kept glancing at him. They knew their boss. Frank Donnelly was not a man who enjoyed being proven wrong, but what surprised them was that he didn't look angry. He looked thoughtful, almost quiet. Walter Brennan climbed down from the steam engine and began gathering the chain. The thick links clanked heavily as he lifted them from the ground. Mud slid off the metal with wet thuds. Frank finally walked toward him. The men nearby stopped talking. Nobody wanted to miss what happened next. Frank stopped a few feet. "And once the engine finds grip," he pointed toward the excavator, "it doesn't rush, just keeps pulling." Frank looked back toward the swamp. For the first time since the problem started, he actually felt relieved. 3 days of pressure had lifted from his shoulders. The contract penalties, the delays, the angry phone calls he expected from the state, all of that had been hanging over him. And somehow, a 73-year-old farmer had solved it in 3 minutes. Frank took a slow breath. "What do I owe you?" Walter looked up. "I told you already." "Donation." Frank raised an eyebrow. "To the Clayton County Historical Society." Frank blinked. "That's it?" Walter nodded. "They helped me restore the engine." Frank glanced back at the massive machine. "You restored this yourself?" "Mostly." Walter patted the iron boiler. "Found it in my grandfather's shed back in the 80s. Sat there almost 30 years. Frank looked impressed. "And it still runs like that?" Walter smiled. "These engines were built different. No electronics, no sensors, no computers telling them when to quit." Frank laughed quietly. "So basically, it's too stubborn to stop." Walter grinned. "Something like that." Frank reached into his jacket and pulled out a checkbook. One of the engineers nearby whispered to another, "I think this is the part where he writes a big check." Frank didn't hesitate. He wrote the amount quickly, tore the check free, and handed it to Walter. Walter glanced down at it. $10,000. Walter looked back up. "That's generous." Frank shrugged. "You saved me 70. Walter folded the check carefully and placed it in his pocket. "Well," he said, "the museum will appreciate it." Frank nodded. Then he looked up at the steam engine again. "Something?" Walter waited. "I spent 30 years building this company." Walter listened quietly. "I always believed the newest machines were the best machines." Walter leaned against the iron wheel. "That belief probably helped you succeed." Frank nodded. "Maybe." Then he looked at the engine again. "But yesterday a machine built in 1912 just did something my $1 million equipment couldn't." Walter smiled faintly. "That doesn't mean your equipment is bad." Frank raised an eyebrow. "No?" Walter shook his head. "Modern machines are incredible. Faster, safer, easier to run." Frank nodded slowly. "That's true," Walter continued. "But every tool has a job it was designed for." He pointed toward the swamp. That job wasn't theirs. Frank thought about that. It made sense, painfully simple sense. For 3 days they had attacked the problem like engineers. Walter had approached it like a farmer, not by overpowering the land, but by understanding it. Frank extended his hand. Walter shook it again. "You're welcome here any time," Frank said. Walter chuckled. "Hopefully not for the same problem." The workers nearby laughed. Frank looked toward the swamp one more time. "I'll make sure nobody drives anything out there again." Walter smiled. "Good plan." Frank turned and started walking back toward his truck. Then he stopped. "Walter." The old farmer looked up. Frank pointed at the steam engine. "That thing really built in 1912? Walter nodded proudly. "Case steam traction engine." Frank whistled softly. "That makes it older than my grandfather." Walter climbed back onto the operator's platform. "Still stronger too," he said with a grin. The crew laughed. Walter pulled a lever. Steam hissed. The massive wheels began, turning again. The engine rolled down the dirt road the way it had arrived. 5 miles an hour, black smoke drifting lazily into the sky. Workers stood quietly watching it disappear. Down the road, one of the engineers shook his head. "I just watched a 100-year-old tractor outwork everything on this site." The mechanic beside him smiled. "That's the thing about old machines." The engineer looked at him. "What?" The mechanic nodded toward the road where the steam engine was disappearing. "They weren't built to impress anyone," he paused. "They were built to work."